I'd like to thank Brother Donis for the opportunity to bring you a devotional today. Thanks to COVID, this is how we're doing things, but that's all right. I'm going to get a little personal with you today concerning my life and my prayer for my immediate future. You may have little to no knowledge of the daily life of a quadriplegic and the things that go into getting ready every day. And we'll just say that it's not glamorous. Right now, though, in Louisville, Kentucky, there are 36 spots in a groundbreaking study that has shown remarkable promise for people dealing with chronic paralysis such as mine. There is so much promise shown that there are quads across the planet applying to get into this study. So much so that the numbers have ballooned well into the thousands. I found out early on through an article online and got my information put into the system. But when I called last fall to figure out the way things were going, all 36 spots had been filled. And the lady said that she didn't know if there would be another study in the future because it was all in flux depending on the results. And that there were still 464 people in line in front of me should there have been another one. And then in February of this year, I got a call and was notified that one participant had decided not to participate and that the computer algorithm had chosen me to be the one individual to replace them. So, I was a bit in shock and unsure of how this had happened. How did it come to select me? Because after all, I had prayed for 12 years that something like this might come around and offer a chance in my life. But thus far, nothing had happened and my condition remained the same as it is today. Oh me of little faith. God has just tossed 464 plus the participant we were originally in, so 465 mountains into the sea to provide me with this opportunity. And I'm going to ask how. You see, they use the terminology computer algorithm. I'm going to supply the names Yahweh and Jehovah and King of Kings to explain how the seemingly impossible had become possible. There are a lot of questions left, a lot of concerns, things that still have me pretty worked up about it, including a final on-site screening in Kentucky in the beginning of August, which has been delayed and delayed. But I have to believe that if this is how God plans to relieve an affliction in my life, that this is how He'll do it. And if it's not His plan, then things won't work out and I won't be in the program, and I will just simply have to continue to rely on His grace to get me through. So with all that background, today we're going to be looking in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, beginning in verse 7. I'll read it. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Neither Christian life nor non-Christian life is devoid of problems. God has not supplied immunity from suffering. But God does know how to balance our lives. You see, too many blessings leads to too much pride. So He permits us to encounter trials as well. Here, God has allowed Satan to buffet Paul to keep him grounded, because as he writes in this letter, 14 years before, he had been called up into heaven. And I can imagine that would lead to the human side of us being a little boastful. Look what God thinks of me. He called me up into heaven. The secrets of our suffering are not going to be entirely revealed in this life. Sometimes it's simply because we're human. Sometimes we've grown older. Family members can break our hearts. Maybe we've been disobedient in respect of God. Maybe our rebellion has seen us push the limits further than what God is willing to allow us to and he just says, okay, here's what happens. By his grace, God forgives our sin, but through his governance, we must be allowed to reap what we've sown. Suffering is something that also can be used to build character. Paul's thorn was permitted by God to keep him from becoming prideful. As experiencing, once again, heaven, I imagine, would do. But the actual translation of thorn here, it's not like a rose thorn, like what would usually come to my mind. Upon researching it, it's more of a tent stake or something that can be used to impale someone. So this was much more than some mild prick of the finger. And just as God permitted Satan to afflict Job and to afflict Paul, he allows him to afflict us as well. But how we react to that affliction is the key to where our lives will be steered. And if you notice how Paul reacted, he prayed 3 times that God should remove this from him. I've prayed over the years that my thorn, my obvious thorn, would be removed. It started off with, God, would you just work some miracle in my life to restore the health of my body in a way that only you can? Then, God, could you provide some level of recovery as to increase my independence? Then, God, would you give a doctor somewhere the knowledge necessary to deliver a breakthrough that could provide some hope? And then, God, could you just provide me with the mental fortitude that would allow me to handle the condition that I'm in? There's several ways that you can deal with suffering. We can be bitter and blame God. I went through rehab with a man same age as me, same injury. He just hated God for it. Hated it. And he was recovering. Had a conversation with him one night. I don't know if he continued on with his hatred of God elsewhere, but he didn't around me anymore. We can just cave in and give up entirely. We can put up a front and fight it tooth and nail, leaving us exhausted in the end. We can pray for strength to accept whatever God deems fit for us in his service. Because God isn't obligated to heal. Paul didn't know if this was a temporary or permanent thorn in his flesh, just as I don't know if my current state of paralysis is a current or temporary thorn in my flesh. This doesn't mean that we need to stop bringing our concerns and such to God in prayer, but it does mean that we need to be willing to understand and accept that he may leave that thorn in. Paul had gone to paradise, to pain, and back to paradise again. He's tasted of the glory of heaven, only to return to earth and be buffeted by Satan. His experience in heaven prepared him for the suffering on earth, but then he also learned that heaven could come to him, as he speaks of sufficient grace in verse 9. The lyrics go something like, grace, grace, God's grace, grace that is greater than all our sin. There were two messages that Paul takes note of here. Satan means it for harm, but he also learns that God has meant it for good. Verse 9 tells us that whatever may be afflicting us and making us weaker can be used to showcase the power of God. The amount of God's grace can be measured by turning over a can of Coke and finding out that this particular can just never stops pouring out that good, fizzy soda goodness. It just keeps going and going and going. Even the Energizer Bunny can't compare. Because God's grace covers all our physical needs, mental needs, physical needs, spiritual needs. But it's a process, and it's a continuous process. His power is being made perfect through your weakness. Sometimes it's about transformation instead of substitution. My prayer for an instantaneous miracle following my injury wasn't supplied, and that was for a reason. God knew that I had a ways to go, and He wanted me to see it through. Only He knows the time that's right to restore my health. And that's hard to handle at times because there's so many things that I'd love to be able to be doing. But I'm learning and continuing to learn to live in this condition, in my situation, as best as I can, because it's a continuous and transformative process. And then Paul starts to look at this thorn as maybe a gift. God's grace made it so that Paul's affliction worked in his favor, worked for him instead of against him. Paul turns it into a thing to boast of, and how through his weakness, more power was brought to the name of Christ. If only it was so easy to be that laser focused all the time, right? Paul fed off that grace that was offered to alter his affliction. Have you ever prepared a meal and left an ingredient out? My mom tells this story of when my papa and granny, JC and Edna Lemons, were at the house of a member of a church one night for dinner. And I guess it was customary back then, or maybe just in this particular family's household, that the guest was served dessert first after everyone finished dinner. And so the lady gets up and gives Papa a piece of chocolate pie. And so conversation around the table continues, and Papa's eating his pie, and he finishes, and the lady then gets up and delivers a piece of pie to everyone else at the table. The lady's son takes a bite, chews it a few moments, and spits it out and says, "What is wrong with this pie? It is disgusting." It turns out that the lady had incidentally not put sugar in when she was making the pie, which apparently meant it was pretty gross. But it was so close to being great. Is grace the one ingredient that's missing in your life? And wouldn't your affliction be made so much easier if you had God's grace in your life?